So I did something that some people might consider a total waste of time, but I thought that this was interesting because it's an ongoing discussion that is very, very common on the internet these days, which is, as I've touched on some other recent videos, the subject of whether mass media is in decline. Like in particular, people talk about movies, TV shows, video games, books, music, like the question, like, is stuff actually declining? And so what I've done is looking at movies in particular. Like I'm not looking at any of the other mediums here, just movies. I made a list of every movie ever made that I've seen as far as I can remember. I'm sure there's one or two or three, maybe a few that I've probably forgotten, but by and large, it's every movie that I've ever seen that I think is either a 9 or a 10 out of 10. And I've organized them according to which decade they came out to try and figure out if movies are actually in decline quality wise. Now, again, this is very biased according to my subjective opinion. I don't pretend that my opinion is objective fact when it comes to the quality of movies. There's obviously a generational bias here. I'm a millennial, a very like middle of the road millennial. Like I was born right at the heart of the millennial era. So I don't pretend there isn't a bias there in terms of when these movies came out because I'm obviously biased in favor of movies that came out when I was young, like I would say when I was a child or a teenager. I'm definitely biased in favor of those movies, and I don't pretend otherwise. But at the same time, I think this is an interesting exercise to see is there a decline going on. So anyway, I'm gonna run through the numbers right here. So for all of the movies that I looked at, movies that I would consider 9 out of 10 or a 10, there's only one from the 1930s, which is The Wizard of Oz. I actually had none from the 40s or 50s. Now, again, like a lot of people think that those are the decades when the best movies were made, like the really old classics. To be honest, I'm not big on movies from that era. Maybe it's because I'm a very visual person and I find like just the picture quality and sound quality is not all that great from that era. Some of the old Disney movies I was tempted to put on the list, but when I thought about it, I'm like, you know what? I can't think of one movie that's quite good enough to be a 9 or a 10. Maybe Snow White, Pinocchio, and a few others might come close, but they just didn't quite make the cut, in my opinion. So, yeah, none from the 40s or 50s, and only one from the 30s, which is The Wizard of Oz. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So, from the 1960s, I had two movies on the list, which were Rosemary's Baby and Psycho. Now, so far, none of these movies is a 10 in my opinion. These are all 9s. So going further on this, so we have one from the 30s, two from the 60s, none from the 40s and 50s. I had 8 movies from the 1970s. Now, at this point, the list is long enough that I'm not going to go through them one by one. Except maybe like the 10s. I'll say like there were, okay, 8 from the 70s. And then out of those 8, 3 of them I would consider 10s, which were A New Hope, the original Star Wars movie, Taxi Driver, and A Clockwork Orange. So we're getting into like darker territory. In fact, we were getting into darker territory in the 60s. I mean, we already had Psycho and Rosemary's Baby then. So there's those. In the 1980s, I have 19 movies on the list in total, 9s and 10s. So definitely a big jump from the 70s to 80s. However, I have only, again, 3 movies that I would consider 10 out of 10 from the 80s, which is equal to the 70s. And those 3 movies are Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, and The Empire Strikes Back. I think Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade are both solid 9s, but they're not quite a 10 for me. They're very fun movies. I guess they just didn't have the emotional impact necessary to be a 10. Like that, for it to be a 10, it has to push it over the line in some ways. And I think their Raiders of the Lost Ark and Last Crusade are as good as like an adventure movie can be. But to be a 10, they have to have a little bit more of that like profound element to them, I guess you could say. So that's why they don't quite make the cut there. But they're very strong nines, both of them. So yeah, 19 nines or tens from the 1980s. From the 1990s, this is where we get into the era that I'm obviously biased in favor of. We have 54 movies in total on the list, of which 12 of them are tens. Now, at this point, I'm not even going to list them all because it's getting to be so many. But yeah, 12 movies from the 1990s. I might put them in the description, like all the movies on the list, if YouTube allows me to have all that that much written content in the notes, which I'm not sure if it will in the description, but we'll see. So yeah, 54 in the 90s, and then 60 movies from the 2000s, of which 11 are tens. So that's actually slightly more movies in total from the 2000s than the 90s, but one less that's a 10. So the 90s and the 2000s are pretty much neck and neck for my favorite decades. Then comes the 2010s, which are still a strong decade, but a bit of a decline because we have 43 movies on the list from the 2010s, and then 8 movies that are 10 out of 10. Now, again, like, a lot of people are going to disagree with me here. A lot of people probably don't like the movies from the 2010s or even the 2000s, for that matter, as much as I do, and that's fine. You're entitled to have your own opinion, but that's my opinion, so take it for what it's worth. Now, from the current decade so far, which we're about a third of the way into, actually, wait a second. 2021, 22. No, we're more than a third of the way, because, yeah, we're more than a third of the way into the 2020s, just slightly more than a third. So far, there are 6 movies on the list from the 2020s and 0 tens from the 2020s. That's pretty abysmal. So if it continues on the current trajectory, there would be like 18 movies, which is about on par with the 80s, and no tens at all. So that would be like every decade since the 70s, including the 70s, and since then has had some tens. And so far, the 2020s have had none, which is very, very sad, very pathetic. My favorite movie of the 2020s so far is Dune Part 1. I thought it was a very good adaptation, but it's just not quite a 10 for me. So yeah, no 10s so far in the 2020s and only 6. So just to recap, by decade we had for 9s and 10s, we had 1 in the 30s, 0 in the 40s or 50s, 2 in the 60s, 8 in the 70s, 19 in the 80s, 54 in the 90s, 60 in the 2000s, 43 in the 2010s, and 6 so far in the 2020s. And then for 10s specifically, we had 3 in the 70s, 3 in the 80s, 12 in the 90s, 11 in the 2000s, 8 in the 2010s, and 0 so far in the 2020s. So that gives kind of a picture of the bell curve of cinema quality for me in particular. It really peaked in the 90s and the 2000s. It was sort of like, it was starting to really go up in the 70s and 80s, peaked in the 90s and 2000s. It went down a bit in the 2010s, but the 2010s were still a fairly strong decade. And now it's starting to crash and burn in the 2020s. So that's sort of the trajectory of cinema for me. And again, I think it's better to look at like the really good movies, because if I was to like try to do some average of like every movie that I've seen from every decade, that would take really long, and B, I don't think that would actually give as good a picture, because at the end of the day, it's the really good movies that people remember. People don't remember all the shitty movies and all the mediocre movies. So I think when looking at cinema quality, what's most important is to look at how many 9s and 10s there are in a given year, like the movies that really stand out. And again, like some of my choices, I don't know if YouTube will let me write like that number of words in the description. So I don't know if I can actually list the movies. I'll try to list all the movies, but At very least, I could probably list all the tens. But like again, my opinion is very subjective, and I get it. Not everybody's going to agree with me on every entry in the list. Some of them people will flagrantly disagree with me, and that's fine. But yeah, those are. And again, I don't have the Godfather movies because honestly, I tried. I watched all three of them. I thought they were just okay. I thought they were over long and kind of boring. And again, you could say, well, I was too young to appreciate them. That is possibly true, but at the same time, I feel like I watched a lot of other movies at that age that made the list that would be considered like kind of long and boring, like Apocalypse Now, for instance, which was also directed by the same director, Francis Ford Coppola. And like, I don't know, like Taxi Driver, I had that as a 10 out of 10. That's fairly slow paced. I mean, who knows? Maybe I do need to rewatch the Godfather films, at least parts 1 and 2. Maybe they deserve to be on this list. I don't have them on the list currently at all because, you know, I as Peter Griffin said, yeah, I didn't care for the Godfather. But maybe I'm wrong, okay? Like I fully admit maybe I'm wrong on that one because when there's something that like literally everybody says is great and I didn't care for it that much, maybe I do need to rewatch the movies. And another movie that I didn't have on the list that like everybody does is No Country for Old Men. I thought it was okay but not great. Same with Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Both of those came out in the 2000s, which is a decade that I'm apparently biased in favor of. So there you go. But yeah, those ones they didn't make the list for me. I thought they were all right, but just not great. So yeah, again, like those would be some of the more controversial omissions. But and I didn't have any Tarantino films other than Pulp Fiction on the list. But yeah, I mean, those would be my most controversial omissions, but a lot of the ones on the list are the movies you'd expect to be there. Like a lot of them are from the IMDb top 250. And most of them are movies that got either good critical reviews, good audience reviews, or both. There's very few that didn't get either good reviews from. The only one that came close to getting good reviews from neither is Event Horizon. But to be fair, that is kind of a cult classic, and there are a lot of people who will stand up and say that was a great horror movie and a really scary movie. So there you go. So that's the list as it stands right now. The picture of the bell curve of the rise and fall of cinema. So yeah, please let me know what your thoughts are.